If I was an African American smoker who wanted to continue smoking for the rest of my life, I would consider. Good afternoon, friends. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the most powerful thing someone can do to stop themselves from getting lung cancer after quitting smoking. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. Now let's get started. First of all, I want to point out that lung cancer is a very serious concern. Lung cancer is among the top 4 most frequent cancers in their incidence in the United States. And in some countries, it's the cancer with the highest rate of incidence, like in China, for example. In the United States, though, lung cancer is still the most deadly of the top 4 cancers. Most of you know that lung cancer is much more common among smokers than non-smokers. About 55% of people who are diagnosed with lung cancer are current smokers, while between 85 to 90% of them did smoke during their lifetimes. Interestingly, the majority of smokers don't actually develop lung cancer. About 80% of them don't develop it, but the other 20% is so disproportionately large in the population. Now, what we're here to talk about in regard to lung cancer is the fact that it may appear slightly racist. There's something called the African American smoking paradox. What that describes is the fact that African Americans are much less likely to smoke. They generally start smoking cigarettes at an older age and smoke less, but they are disproportionately affected by lung cancer. African Americans are about 17% more likely to develop lung cancer than European Americans. Now, although African Americans are much more likely to develop lung cancer, that regards their incidence of lung cancer. They aren't less likely to survive it as compared to European Americans. So it's the incidence, not survivability, but it's a major difference. And speaking of that, actually, there's another paradox called the Hispanic paradox of smoking, which describes the fact that Hispanics are about doubly less likely to develop lung cancer than the average population. They have greatly reduced lung cancer incidence, but also they have improved survival from lung cancer, meaning less lung cancer mortality. So lung cancers affect us differently. They're much more common among African Americans and, for example, native Hawaiians than they are among Hispanics or Japanese. They have a preferential association with West African ancestry. The portion of West African ancestry an American has is linearly associated with their likelihood of developing lung cancer. Although this relationship is slightly weakened when income and education are controlled for. It's still remarkable. Also, lung cancers in African Americans as compared to European Americans function biologically differently. Also, our genetic variants affect lung cancer differently. African Americans carry variants that predispose them to coronary artery disease that also predispose them to lung cancer. And there are other variants that predispose African Americans to lung cancer that do not have the same effects in Hispanic Americans or European Americans. And the differences between African Americans and European Americans' relationship with lung cancer is even visible in their use of the drug naltrexone. Naltrexone is a drug used to help people with smoking cessation, but it works much better in European Americans than African Americans. In fact, the percentage of European American ancestry in African Americans is associated with naltrexone's effectiveness. Now let's talk about some associations of African Americans' lung cancer incidence. First, African Americans are more likely to develop lung cancer from environmental toxins, not just from smoking themselves. In rural areas where lung cancer incidence is much higher in the US, and smoking is too, the discrepancy between the incidence of lung cancer among African Americans and European Americans gets worse. African Americans are even more predisposed to lung cancer in rural areas than European Americans. In searching for a potential cause over the last couple of decades, academics have even studied African Americans' preferences for mentholated cigarettes. Those are cigarettes that taste like they have mint in them. African Americans are the only ethnic group in the US that has a majority of smokers preferring menthol cigarettes. So academics thought that maybe the menthol cigarette could have something to do with the lung cancer incidence. Interestingly, as a side note, when I was a smoker, I avoided menthol cigarettes because I had heard a rumor that menthol could be worse for the lungs. And when you smoke a menthol cigarette, you feel an odd feeling in your lungs. It turns out menthol cigarettes are not worse for lung cancer incidence. They may actually be less harmful, shockingly. So it wasn't that either. Now, before we move on, I want to comment on this association. Lung cancer incidence is highly associated with African Americans, but it does not mean that their genetics causes them to get lung cancer at a higher rate. It's true, lung cancer behaves differently in them, but it could be an association that has to do with lifestyle or something else. For our purposes in this video, it doesn't really matter. Now that we've established that African Americans have a much higher incidence of lung cancer, let's move on to the second half of this video, which regards the hack. This is the most powerful hack one can take to protect themselves from lung cancer other than not smoking. But before we get into that, I'd like to mention as a side note, there are many other hacks one could make. For example, controlling estrogen with an aromatase inhibitor or an estrogen receptor blocker could be very useful and instrumental in someone avoiding lung cancer, particularly as a smoker. But in this video, we're going to talk about the most powerful hack, which is high altitude living. For every 1,000 meters you live higher than sea level, you experience a 13% reduction in the incidence of lung cancer. Although if you do have a baby, they may weigh about 102 grams less than they would have otherwise. This is extremely powerful. Think of this. If the entire US moved to San Juan County in Colorado, which is about 3,400 kilometers above sea level, we could expect about a 66% reduction in lung cancer incidence. And note that this relationship is sort of the reverse that we talked about in regards to pregnancy and babies being born at high elevations. Specifically, in this case, people who have adapted to high elevations don't experience this reduction in lung cancer incidence. So the mutants that live very well at high elevations actually have an increased incidence of lung cancer, likely due to the genetic adaptation to the high altitude. What I'm suggesting here is that if an African American smoker wanted to smoke for the rest of their lives, they may want to consider moving to a higher elevation. I would consider moving to a 3,000 meter or so elevation, because if I'm an African American, the increased incidence of skin cancer at high elevations, which we'll talk about in a future video, wouldn't affect me as much, and I would be particularly fearful of the lung cancer incidence. So why might higher elevations protect us from lung cancer? The robustness of the relationship seems to indicate that we're being exposed to a reduced amount of a carcinogen as we get higher in elevations. The association, the inverse association between high elevation and both lung cancer and esophageal cancer incidence likely indicates that this carcinogen is inhaled. It's most likely oxygen. In fact, that's what I personally believe. But there's a few potential explanations. We'll cover them briefly here. First of all, let's talk about oxygen availability at high altitudes. When you're 1,000 meters above sea level, you have about 89% the oxygen you would have had at sea level. When you go to 2,000 meters, it's about 79%. And when you're at 3,000, it's about 68%. If you compare the lowest point in the US, which is in Imperial County, I think in California, it's about 11 miles below sea level. If you compare oxygen there and at the highest point, which is in Colorado, you'll find that about a 35% difference in oxygen availability exists. That's massive. But what's harmful about oxygen? Well, think about the word antioxidant. Antioxidant is something that neutralizes free radicals that are reactive oxygen species. Oxygen produces free radicals when we inhale it, intracellular free radicals, which can then damage DNA in our body and greatly increase cancer incidence. Now, in support of this, let's consider a couple of things. First of all, oxygen is known to be particularly carcinogenic, which means it can damage DNA and cause cancers to develop on tissue in humans that it contacts, like the lungs. So the reduction in particularly lung cancer and esophageal cancer incidence makes sense and is in line with the idea that reductions in oxygen may be a causal factor. Also, studies on rodents, which can't really be replicated in humans, show that reductions in ambient oxygen availability reduce tumorigenesis. This is a hard word to pronounce. It means the creation of new tumors. Remember, genesis means the birth of something. But most strikingly of all is the observation that, for those that don't know, sometimes when newborns are born to slightly poorer health, they're given oxygen supplementation. This oxygen supplementation greatly worsens childhood cancer incidence in humans in real life. So there's some evidence to support this, but there are other ideas too. For example, some academics postulated that the increased exposure to radiation from the sun at higher altitudes could act as a kind of hormetic stressor. That means a hormetic stressor is something that causes a stress to your body but yields a net positive effect. Like green tea and turmeric, for example, are hormetic stressors. And in support of this, there are some observational studies that show that radon in our environment. Radon, by the way, is an element that is radioactive. Our proximity to radon may be inversely associated with lung cancer incidence. I personally don't think that this holds much weight. But there are other explanations as well. For example, some academics think it may be the cold, which may make sense. As you saw, the mutants that are adapted to high elevation living actually have increased lung cancer incidence. Well, people who are also adapted to cold living also have increased cancer incidence. And Scandinavians who live in their cold countries and are adapted to it also have increased cancer incidence. When we live at higher elevations, we have less blood levels of iron because our bodies need to produce more red blood cells to account for the reduced oxygen. And iron levels in our blood are associated with cancer incidence. So it could be the reduction of iron. But also at higher elevations, as we'll see in my video on mutants that live at higher elevations, we have increased glycolysis. From lipid oxidation, we switch over to burning sugars, and sugars are potently associated with cancer incidence. Although it depends on the cancer, but generally speaking, sugar consumption is associated with cancer incidence. Further, there's also more physical exercise when we live at higher altitudes because it's more difficult on our bodies. And of course, physical exercise is inversely associated with cancer incidence. Finally, immune function may actually be better at higher elevations. You can look at this, for example, through the lens of the COVID-19. COVID-19 is as deadly, it seems, at higher elevations, but the incidence is greatly reduced. Now, if you're asking my opinion, I think it's a mixture of three factors primarily. One is the reduction in oxygen. One is the increased burning of sugars and potentially physical exercise and things like that. And the third one is a change in the anatomy of the lungs. You see, the lungs of high altitude living people who are not adapted to it genetically function differently. For example, that's the reason why they have a lot of pulmonary hypertension in their lungs. So I think some of these structural changes must have an impact on the lung cancer and is likely quite significant because it's the target organ. Anyway, friends, I hope you found this interesting. I thought it would be a cool way to continue our series on high altitude living. We talked earlier about the danger to babies of being born at high altitudes, as well as the particular danger to the elderly, briefly. But we didn't talk about any advantages. Well, this is the first advantage, and we'll talk about more in future videos. I think the takeaways from this video are lung cancer incidence is a leading cause of death in the most developed nations in the world. Smokers are much more likely to develop lung cancer than others. African Americans are much more likely to develop lung cancer than others. If I was an African American smoker who wanted to continue smoking for the rest of my life, I would consider moving to somewhere like a highly elevated place in Colorado. Anyway, friends, I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning.